Rob Neyer now joins us. This is an old school Royals fan, and that's the first thing I love about him because it reminds me of old school baseball. Also, baseball writer, ESPN, Fox Sports, is a commissioner of the West Coast Baseball League. That is in itself a pretty awesome deal. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here.
First thing I want to ask you is, who is your favorite Royal of all time?
Oh, my gosh. It's really hard to say because it would change every 2 years when I was a kid.
But when you were a kid, they were awesome. And you're a little older than me. But I can remember some of my first memories. Like the first baseball season I truly remember was when they beat the Cardinals in '85. And that was when baseball, to me, was just so magical. And those are some of my purest memories. And I have great memories of those Royals teams.
Yeah, me too. I mean, as a kid, when your team is winning games and has great players and the players tend to be the same every year, which they did when I was a kid, more so than now, it's very easy to fall in love with your team. And so I loved all those guys, and I can rattle off the lineup over the course of 6 or 8, 10 years. But I think ultimately the one I have the most affection for all these years later is probably Frank White, because not only was he an outstanding player with a lot of huge moments, but I also got to know him a little bit after his career and spent some time with him. And so I have a real affection for Frank.
How about when Bo Jackson came to the Royals? I remember.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, when he went to play for the Raiders, he talked about baseball being a hobby or one or the other, and it ruffled a lot of feathers on both sides, right? The Raiders and the Royals. But what was that experience like as somebody who was around the club at the time?
I mean, if you were a fan, as I was, the excitement level was off the charts. Part of it was that as a fan, especially as a young fan, at least this was my experience, you always felt like your team, we're in the Midwest, we're a cow town, we don't get enough attention, blah, blah, blah. I realized with the benefit of a little maturity, I realized how childish those emotions are, but I certainly did have them. So to see Bo Jackson on the cover of Sports Illustrated and see him in the headlines was an ego boost for me, which, again, I realize is silly, but it was a big deal.
And Sports Illustrated back then, as you know, that was it. Like I remember him on the cover in the Memphis Chicks uniform, and it just like it was one of those deals where you remember it forever.
And then he was on the cover later in the Royals uniform when he reached the majors, and of course he hit the home run in the All-Star game. And I remember a million things about those few years. I still have. When I went to Royals games back in those days, my favorite place to sit was out in the left field stand. We used to call it GA, general admission. You'd pay your $2.50 or $3 or whatever it was and sit wherever you wanted out there. And I loved those seats because I got to sit behind Bo Jackson. This is before he moved to center field, and and took Willie Wilson's place. And there was a picture of him, front page of the Kansas City Star in 19, whatever year it was, 88, 89. And if you look at that picture, there's me in the stands standing up cheering for Bo Jackson. I mean, it was a big deal. And as a Royals fan, you just felt you were a part of this thing that was bigger than anything we had seen before as a Royals fan.
And one more question I want to ask you now that we're going down the Royals memory lane. This is a darker memory, but I grew up a Phillies fan. And I remember, it was kind of, I learned about the Phillies' history and beating the Royals in the 1980 World Series. But then I remember, and I'm sure you were at ESPN at the time, I'm not sure what you had to do with this story, probably little to nothing, because I think it was a Jeremy Schaap story, but the Willie Mays Aikens, does that story ring a bell?
Well, oh, sure. I mean, he was huge in the 80 World Series. I believe he was only the second player to hit multiple home runs in 2 World Series games.
He had 4 home runs in the series. 4 home runs in the series. And then he got arrested, though, in 1994. What was that like tracking that story?
Well, it was interesting. He'd been gone from the Royals for so long, and we'd been through so many drug-related stories in Kansas City because in 1980, '84, Willie Wilson missed part of the season, was in prison. Jerry Martin, Vida Blue, I believe there might have been one more, but those three, all three of those guys were not only suspended, but in the case of Willie Wilson, spent some time in prison, and it really affected that '84 season, obviously, but also how people thought about those guys. And so, the Willie Aikens thing, which, by the way, came after he had been not only gone from the Royals for a long time, but had spent a fair number of years in Mexico hitting about 1 million home runs. And of course, I followed him year in, year out, because he would still play. He played into, I believe, his early 40s down in Mexico before he got busted and sent to prison. And so, yeah, I mean, it wasn't. He never really crossed over into being one of my favorite players, because he only had a couple of real good seasons with the Royals. But he's always been a Royal. I have his book. It's pretty good. I guess there was a movie that came out about him a couple years ago, which I have not seen, but I've been meaning to watch that.
So there was a movie about him?
There's a movie, yes. They made a movie about his arrest and his recovery and what happened to him after prison. It's not a documentary; it's a real movie.
Oh, yeah. Wow! Okay, I'll find it. I love all that stuff. Now we transition now from you as a fan and the stuff that kind of had you so taken by baseball to your career. When did you realize that you were a numbers guy and that you were going to work with Bill James and it goes on to Stats Inc. and Sabermetrics?
Well, I have been in my career among the luckiest people ever, because when I went off to college in 1984 to the University of Kansas, which, I wanted to go to Missouri, but I couldn't afford the out-of-state tuition, so I went to Kansas. That's where all my friends were going, and it was cheap. So I went to Kansas, and my first or second day in Lawrence, I went to the bookstore in the Student Union and went straight to the sports section, of course, and I saw a book there. It was called The Bill James Baseball Abstract, 1984. I had never heard of this Bill James character before, but the book looked interesting, and I started leafing through it. And I realized pretty quickly that this guy was writing for me. This was sort of content that my brain really wanted at that exact moment. Royals, by the way, in that '84 season, they were in the middle of a pennant race, which they ultimately won. So I had more passion than usual for the Royals and for baseball generally. And I bought the book, took it back to my apartment, and just devoured it. And basically from that moment on, if you had asked me in college, what's your dream job, Rob? If you could do one thing in the world, what would it be? It would have been work for Bill James. And, it turned out not only did he, and I did not know this at the time, not only did he live about 30 minutes from me, from Lawrence, but we actually had ultimately, a couple years later, we had a mutual friend. And so when Bill was looking for an assistant in 1988, my friend said, "Hey, Rob, you really should apply for this job." And he had to push me to apply for the job, because I couldn't imagine why on earth Bill would ever want to hire somebody like me. At that time, I was a college dropout working as a roofer. And ultimately, I did apply for the job, and obviously Bill hired me, and I spent 4 years with him, and then moved to Stats Inc. for a while, and ultimately ESPN, was there for 15 years, and many things since. But it was just a stroke of good fortune that I happened to find Bill when I found him, and that 4 years later he hired me.
What was the most bizarre story you ended up covering, baseball related, while you were at ESPN?
Oh my gosh, that's a tough one. Bizarre is tricky. I was, for most of my time at ESPN, and I've said many, many times that I sort of regret, I had a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do most of the time I was at ESPN was just watch games and write whatever popped into my head. And I didn't go out and cover a lot of things. Later with other jobs, I did some of those stories. The biggest story that I worked on at ESPN was was the summer of '98 with McGuire and Sousa.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to be sent to St. Louis to a Cubs Cardinals series where McGuire broke the record, and that was an incredible experience. But I think that when I did the most fun I had reporting things was actually years later when I was working at FoxSports.com, and I wrote a story about the summer in which Bill Murray played baseball for the Grays Harbor Loggers in the Northwest League. That was a bizarre story which had really barely been touched on. Nobody's ever written the story. Somehow it's just been missed. So finding the story and then talking to so many people who played with Bill Murray on that team and watched him play. I talked to Father Guido Sarducci, who most people listening probably don't know who that is.
Live, yeah.
SNL, right? And he worked with Bill Murray on a video piece with the Loggers. And I talked to the director of the movie Meatballs, Ivan Reitman. That was the movie Bill Murray left the team for to make that summer, and then he came back to the team at the end of the season. So it was just a really, I don't know how bizarre it was, but it was a hell of a lot of fun to do.
What was the most startling revelation you made while tracking Bill Murray's journey?
Oh, good question. The most startling. I think it was that from Reitman told me that they didn't know Bill Murray. So Meatballs was a formative movie for a lot of us in the late 70s, early 80s. A bit risque. I'm not sure if people still watch it, but boy, it made a big impression on me as a 15-year-old. Well, until the day they started shooting that movie, Ivan Reitman, the director, did not know if Bill Murray was going to show up to make the movie. Bill told him that all he wanted to do that summer was play baseball, and he didn't know if he wanted to work at all. So it wasn't until that day or the day before shooting started that Reitman knew he actually had a lead actor in this movie that he was trying to make.
Try keeping up with talent, right?
Yeah. And Bill Murray hasn't changed.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit about your career as far as your experience and as it lends to some of the stuff that's going on today. One of the things I'm curious to get your take on are Tony Clark and the statement made by the Major League Baseball Players Association just last week, citing that the pitch clock and the fact that it's been reduced is maybe causing some injuries to pitchers. Your insight into that, when you see a statement like that, what do you think right away?
I think it's unfortunate that the Players Association has taken a hardline stance against any changes to the game. And I realize that essentially that Tony Clark is working for the players. I don't think Tony Clark sits in a room by himself and decides what he's going to say publicly about rule changes, pitcher injuries, whatever it might be. The union, and I'm not anti-union at all. I think that generally speaking, whether it's plumbers or electricians or steel workers or cab drivers or baseball players or actors, they probably need representation in the labor market. I get it. But the players union has absolutely no interest in the things that you and I are interested in. What you and I are interested in are being able to go to a game, watch the best players in the world, get ideally a reasonably priced beer, which I guess isn't really possible in Major League Baseball anymore, and we want to see the best players on the field. We don't want to see them hurt. So many of the things, the rule changes baseball has made are to make the game more entertaining for you and for me. A quicker game, a better pace. Everybody loved it last year, the quicker pace, I think, except maybe a few pitchers. I think most of us would like to see the best players on the field as opposed to on injured lists. baseball has the same interest. Baseball right now, MLB is in the middle of a huge effort to keep pitchers healthy, and especially to keep the best pitchers, the ace starting pitchers, healthy and in the game. That's where their interest lies. It's not good for baseball if pitchers get hurt. So for Tony Clark to make a statement that the MLB doesn't care about injuries, or that hasn't thought about these rule changes and what they might do, it results in my opinion, less credibility for both him and the union generally. And he said they haven't studied the issue. The issue's been studied. Nobody's found any connection between the pitch clock and pitcher injuries. I would also say about that if the union is concerned about pitcher injuries and is concerned about the pitch clock or anything else injury related, they have all the financial resources in the world. They can commission their own study.
Yeah.
They can go out and hire an entire department at a major university and say, you know what? Put your best people on this. We'll pay you $8 million. We can afford it. But have they done that? I don't think so. I don't think they have any data. So when he talks about data and MLB not having any, MLB actually has a ton of data. There's also a ton of data at places like Baseball Prospectus and FanGraphs and all these publicly available resources. The union has nothing, at least nothing they've shared.
What do you think about the union and their relationship with Rob Manfred? Is it so bad that, he says black and it seems like they say white?
I don't think it's worse than it's been in the past. Rob Manfred got his job in part because he spent a number of years before he became commissioner as sort of the lead contact between MLB and the union. He understands the economics of the game. And I'm not saying I agree with everything he says or does, because I don't. But he does have a great awareness of labor issues. And I know that he said some things that he shouldn't have said. And we've certainly had some labor squabbles that I think we lost, a few days or a week, a year or two ago. It's hard to keep track of all of them. But generally speaking, the last time that baseball had a serious labor issue in terms of lost games, lost revenues, was 30 years ago. And that's due in part to Manfred's work as commissioner and before he was commissioner. And again, I wouldn't give him all the credit, maybe not even most of the credit. But I grew up in an era, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, early 90s, when it was just part of the deal. Every 5, 10, 15 years, you just lose part of the season. And it's now been 30 years since that has happened in a significant sort of season-busting way. So somebody deserves credit for that. I give credit to both sides, sure. But but you're right, the union publicly seems to be against everything Rob Manfred is for. And I think that, as a fan, it's frustrating because I feel like a lot of the things that baseball has done have made the game better over the last 4, 5, 6 years. And I think they're working on some other things to make it better. If their effort to keep pitchers on the field, especially the best pitchers on the field for more innings, if it works, that's going to make the game more enjoyable for all of us, I think.
Oh, it already has. A couple more things before I let you get out of here. I got to get your take on the situation in Oakland. The A's announced they're moving to Sacramento, air quotes, in the meantime, before they would move to Las Vegas. How have we gotten here with that organization? I mean, is it the city that just hasn't stepped up and fought to keep this team? Because, again, people have never really turned out in droves to go see games in Oakland. The stadium is a dump, especially now, and there hasn't been a ton of incentive. On the field, they have had a pretty good product, but even when they won World Series back in the 70s, their attendance was always suspect. What is the issue there? Is it the organization in itself, or is it the city, or is it something else I'm missing?
Well, first of all, I will say I am by no means an expert on that particular situation, but I have been observing it for quite a long time. And I will push back a little, just to be accurate. The A's drew a huge number of fans in the late 80s when they were also winning World Series, right? They had a run from that run from 88 to 90. I think those were the 3 years when they went to the World Series every year. They were either at the top or very close to the top of attendance in MLB, certainly in the American League. There was one weird year where they drew a ton of fans, and the Giants, I guess it was the year they both went to the World Series.
89, right?
And played each other. 89. Both of those teams, people say there aren't enough fans in the Bay Area for two. Well, both of those teams drew exceptionally well. And that was in Candlestick, another place where people used to say, what a dump. It was a dump. I was there. But you put the right product on the field, and the Saints, this happened in Oakland too, and fans will show up. Now, that ballpark became significantly less friendly when they built Mount Davis, as they call it, the second deck in the outfield. But look, the real issue to me is that the dollars have gotten much bigger, and the owners in professional sports have come to expect that it doesn't matter if he's worth $8 billion. I think the A's owner's worth $3 or $4 billion. We expect the local city, county, state, whoever it is, to pony up hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes even more, not just to build up the stadium or help build up the stadium, but also to create an entertainment district around the stadium. Essentially, the owners are expecting, and they usually get it, massive tax breaks or just straight out financial payments so they can build a bigger, better business. And there are a lot of voters out there who are fine with that because they don't want to lose their team or they want to get a new team. And there are a lot of voters who are not okay with that and say, wait a second, we have a lot of issues here where I live. And if I were in Oakland, I'd probably be saying this. Is this where I want all the money to be going, or whatever extra money we seem to have to the billionaire? I'm not sure. I respect both sides of that argument, but I do think that billionaires. The real issue with the guy in Oakland is that their public relations have been just brutal. They just have not been able to read the room for a few years now, and that's why this looks even worse than it usually does in these situations.
All right, last question for you, and I'll get you out of here because you really stoked my interest when you talked about the summer of '98. Do you feel gypped at all? Should we feel gypped at all by the steroid scandal? It was something that I really enjoyed and I found totally captivating and terribly interesting. But looking back, it doesn't bother me really. As a purist, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know that I think of myself as a purist. I tend to look at baseball history as history. In the late teens, people know about the Black Sox scandal, the 1919 World Series, and that it was thrown. But there was gambling and the throwing of ball games or the bribery of players. That sort of thing was pretty rampant for a number of years. And it kind of just had to get so bad that they did something radical to fix it, which is that they banned a bunch of guys and hired a commissioner who didn't show any mercy. A lot of people will talk about baseball in the 1930s or 40s as being this sort of golden era of baseball, except that there literally weren't any black players in the American League or the National League, right? I mean, I think that you can go back to every era and you can find something where if you're a purist, you might say, wait a second, that really wasn't so pure.
Yeah.
I don't know what I think about that era. Kind of messed up. baseball in the 1960s or the 1950s. There are people who are passionate. That's the golden era, the 1950s. Yeah, you did have black players finally, but you also had basically the World Series in New York every year with a bunch of teams that couldn't compete year in, year out. It wasn't very competitive. So I don't know that there's a perfect era of baseball. There are certainly some I find more interesting than others, but I try to place the steroids and before that the amphetamines, well, and after too, frankly, and the cocaine of the early '80s. I kind of look at it all try to look at it all in perspective. This is something that happened. If it's negative, we hope it's not happening anymore. And I certainly think baseball is more fun when players aren't clearly on drugs. But I never felt like I had been cheated by McGwire and Sousa. I was disappointed when they lied later about what they had done. I think that's where you would like people to be honest and set a good example for everybody else in the world. But, they were products of their environment. And the environment at that moment was accepting, if not supportive, of players using lots of drugs. It just was.
Rob, I thank you so much for your time, dude. Can we do it again sometime? I could talk to you forever.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Yeah, dude, I thank you so much for your time. And, we'll chat again soon if you be up for that. But I really appreciate it.
Anytime. You bet. Take care.
All right, take care. Rob Neyer.
We are Rogue Media Sports.